It was one of those rainy afternoons in downtown Chicago, the kind where the sky seems to press down on the city with its heavy gray clouds. The streets were slick with rainwater, reflecting the neon lights of shops and restaurants like a shimmering mosaic. People hurried along the sidewalks, clutching umbrellas or pulling up hoods to shield themselves from the downpour. Amid all this chaos, a man sat behind the wheel of a city bus, navigating his route with practiced ease. This man wasn't just any bus driver. He had been doing this job for over 20 years. He knew every bump, every pothole, and every corner of his route like the back of his hand. But what set him apart wasn't just his experience, it was his heart. This man carried a warmth that made passengers feel safe, even on days when life felt overwhelming. His calm demeanor and friendly smile had become something of a trademark among regular riders. On this particular day, though, his attention would be drawn away from the usual rhythm of his work. As he approached the final stop of his shift, something unusual caught his eye. Standing alone at the curb, drenched from head to toe, was a small boy. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The child stood there shivering, tears streaming down his face as he clutched a stuffed bear tightly against his chest. It was clear that something was wrong. The sight tugged at the bus driver's heartstrings. Without hesitation, he slowed the vehicle to a stop and stepped out into the storm. Raindrops pelted his jacket as he walked toward the boy, his boots splashing through puddles. Kneeling down to meet the child at eye level, he spoke softly, trying not to startle him. "Hey there, little buddy," he said. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" At first, the boy didn't respond. His wide, frightened eyes darted around as if searching for someone, or perhaps hoping no one would notice him crying. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the boy managed to whisper, "I can't find my daddy." His voice cracked, betraying how scared he truly was. The bus driver's heart sank. He could see the fear etched onto the boy's face, and it broke something inside him. Without wasting another second, he took off his jacket and draped it over the boy's shoulders. "Don't worry," he reassured him. "We'll figure this out together. What's your name?" The boy hesitated for a moment before replying, "Ethan." "Well, Ethan," the bus driver said with a warm smile, "you're safe now. Let's get you out of this rain." He guided Ethan back onto the bus, making sure the child was comfortable before closing the doors behind them. Inside, the air was warm compared to the cold outside, and Ethan seemed to relax slightly once they were seated. The bus driver grabbed a granola bar from his lunchbox and handed it to the boy. "Here, eat this, you must be hungry." Ethan accepted the snack gratefully, nibbling on it as he looked up at the man who had rescued him. For the first time since being found, he began to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things would turn out all right. The bus driver kept talking to Ethan, asking gentle questions to help piece together what had happened. Slowly, the boy opened up. He explained that he and his father had come to the city for the weekend. They'd stopped at a toy store earlier, and while Ethan had been distracted by a giant robot display, his dad had disappeared. Now he didn't know where to go or how to find him. Listening carefully, the bus driver nodded. "That must have been really scary for you," he said. "But don't worry. We're going to get you back to your dad, I promise." Even as he spoke, the bus driver knew this wouldn't be easy. The city was vast, and without much information to go on, finding Ethan's father would take some effort. Still, he refused to let doubt creep in. Instead, he focused on keeping the boy calm and reassured. Little did he know, this simple act of kindness would lead to an extraordinary chain of events that neither of them could have anticipated. After making sure the boy was settled on the bus, the driver knew he couldn't just sit there and wait for someone to magically show up looking for Ethan. He had a responsibility now, to keep this lost child safe and do everything in his power to reunite him with his family. The rain outside hadn't let up. If anything, it seemed to be coming down harder, drumming against the windows of the bus like an impatient visitor demanding entry. But inside, the warmth of the bus provided a small sanctuary from the storm and from the fear that still lingered in Ethan's eyes. The driver decided to take action. First, he called dispatch over the radio to report finding a lost child. "I've got a young boy here who says he can't find his dad," he explained. "He mentioned something about being near a toy store earlier. Can you send someone to help us out?" Dispatch assured him they'd notify the authorities and get back to him as soon as possible. Still, the driver knew these things could take time, especially on a busy day like this one. Until then, it was up to him to comfort Ethan and try to piece together more details. "All right, champ," the driver said, turning back to Ethan with a reassuring smile. "Let's see if we can figure out where you last saw your dad. You said he was at a toy store, right? Do you remember anything else about it? Was it big or small? Did it have a sign outside?" Ethan thought hard, his brow furrowing as he tried to recall the details. After a moment, his face lit up slightly. "It had robots," he exclaimed, his voice tinged with excitement despite the situation. "Big ones. And my daddy said I could look at them but not touch." The driver chuckled softly. "Robots, huh? That sounds pretty cool. Maybe we can find that store together. Does anything else stand out? Like what the street looked like or any stores nearby?" Ethan tilted his head, thinking harder. "There was, a pizza place next door, with a red roof." That was a clue worth holding on to. A pizza place with a red roof wasn't uncommon, but combined with the mention of robots, it might narrow down their search. The driver nodded encouragingly. "Good job, buddy, that helps a lot. Now let's see if we can find that pizza place and go from there." With Ethan feeling a little more hopeful, the driver climbed back into the driver's seat and started the engine. As the bus rumbled to life, Ethan looked around curiously, taking in the familiar sights of the city streets through the foggy windows. To distract him further, the driver began pointing out landmarks along the way. "See that tall building over there?" he asked, gesturing toward a skyscraper gleaming faintly through the rain. "That's where they make all the news shows. And over here, this is Millennium Park. Ever heard of it?" Ethan shook his head, but his curiosity was piqued. "What's so special about it?" he asked. "Well," the driver replied with a grin, "there's a giant silver bean-shaped sculpture there. People call it the Bean. Kids love running around it because it makes funny reflections of themselves. Maybe someday you and your dad can check it out." Ethan smiled faintly at the idea, though his expression quickly turned serious again. "Do you think we'll find him soon?" he asked quietly. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his heart aching at the vulnerability in the boy's voice. "I know we will," he said firmly. "We're going to keep looking until we do. Your dad's probably out there right now doing the same thing, searching for you. So don't give up hope, okay?" As they drove closer to the area Ethan described, the driver kept the conversation light, telling stories about his own childhood growing up in the city. He talked about playing stickball in the alleys, sneaking into movie theaters before anyone noticed, and even getting lost himself once when he was younger. "I ended up at a candy shop," he admitted with a laugh. "Turns out, getting lost isn't always so bad." Ethan giggled softly, the sound bringing a sense of relief to the driver. It was moments like these, simple, human connections, that reminded him why he loved his job. Sure, driving a bus wasn't glamorous, but it gave him opportunities to make a difference in people's lives, often in ways he never expected. Today was shaping up to be one of those days. Finally, after what felt like forever, they arrived at the part of town Ethan had described. There it was, a toy store sandwiched between a pizza place with a bright red roof and a pharmacy. The driver pulled the bus to the curb and turned off the engine. "Okay, Ethan," he said, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Let's go inside and see if anyone knows anything about your dad." Ethan hesitated for a moment, gripping his stuffed bear tightly. "What if he's not here?" he asked, his voice trembling. The driver knelt down beside him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "Then we'll keep looking. We won't stop until we find him. Trust me, okay?" Ethan nodded slowly, his trust in the driver growing stronger with each passing minute. Together, they stepped off the bus and into the rain-soaked street. The driver held an umbrella over Ethan's head as they approached the toy store, shielding him from the worst of the downpour. Inside, the store buzzed with activity, families browsing shelves filled with colorful toys, kids marveling at displays of remote-controlled cars and dolls, and employees restocking racks. At the counter, the driver asked to speak with the manager. When a middle-aged woman appeared, he explained the situation calmly. "This little guy got separated from his dad earlier today," he said, motioning to Ethan. "They were here looking at some robot toys. Have you seen anyone asking about a missing child?" The manager frowned, shaking her head. "No, I'm sorry. No one has reported anything like that. But if you want, I can put up a notice or alert our staff to keep an eye out." "That would be great," the driver replied gratefully. Turning to Ethan, he added, "See? We're doing everything we can. This is just one step closer to finding your dad." Though the news wasn't what they'd hoped for, Ethan didn't seem as upset as before. Something about the driver's unwavering determination made him feel safer, more confident that they'd eventually succeed. Back on the bus, the driver handed Ethan another granola bar and cracked a joke about how many snacks he'd need to grow strong enough to lift a real robot someday. Ethan laughed, his spirits lifting bit by bit. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the dirt and grime of the city streets. But inside the bus, a bond had formed between two strangers brought together by chance. Neither of them realized yet how much this encounter would change both of their lives. For now, they focused on the task at hand, finding Ethan's father. And as long as the driver was around, Ethan knew he wouldn't have to face the storm alone. After leaving the toy store without any leads, the driver and Ethan climbed back onto the bus. The rain was still pouring outside, relentless and cold, but inside the bus, there was a sense of quiet determination. The driver could see that Ethan was trying his best to stay brave, though his little hands trembled slightly as he clutched his stuffed bear. It broke the driver's heart to think about how scared the boy must have been when he first realized he'd lost his dad. "All right, buddy," the driver said, settling into his seat behind the wheel. "We've checked the toy store, so now we need to think bigger. Your dad is probably out there looking for you too, right? So let's figure out where he might go next." Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes wide with both fear and hope. "Do you think he went to the police?" he asked in a small voice. "That's a good thought," the driver replied, impressed by the boy's quick thinking. "If your dad couldn't find you, he'd definitely want to get help. Let's head over to the nearest station and see if anyone has reported a missing child." With that plan in mind, the driver started the engine and pulled away from the faux curb. As they drove through the city streets, he kept the mood light by pointing out interesting sights along the way. He told Ethan stories about some of the buildings they passed, how one had been used in a famous movie or how another housed a secret speakeasy during Prohibition. At first, Ethan listened quietly, but soon he began asking questions, his curiosity outweighing his fear. "What's a speakeasy?" Ethan asked, tilting his head. The driver chuckled. "Well, back in the old days, people weren't allowed to drink alcohol, so they opened secret bars hidden behind fake walls or doors. Only people who knew the password could get in." "Did they have robots guarding them?" Ethan joked, surprising himself with his own humor. The driver burst out laughing. "Not quite, but I bet they would have loved that idea. Maybe you should invent one someday, a robot bouncer." Ethan giggled at the thought, imagining a giant mechanical guard standing outside a hidden bar. For a few minutes, the weight of the situation lifted, and the two shared a moment of genuine connection. But as they approached the police station, reality came rushing back. Ethan grew quiet again, staring out the window as the bus slowed to a stop. Inside the station, the driver led Ethan to the front desk where an officer greeted them warmly. "How can I help you folks today?" she asked, her tone friendly but professional. "We're looking for this young man's father," the driver explained. "He got separated from him earlier today near a toy store downtown. Has anyone come in reporting a missing child?" The officer frowned, glancing at Ethan before typing something into her computer. After a moment, she shook her head. "I'm sorry, but no one has filed a report matching this description yet. However, I can put out a bulletin and notify other stations in case someone calls it in later." "That would be great," the driver said gratefully. Turning to Ethan, he added, "See, we're doing everything we can. Every step brings us closer to finding your dad." Though the news wasn't what they'd hoped for, Ethan didn't seem as upset as before. Something about the driver's calm confidence made him feel like everything would work out, even if it took a little longer than expected. On the way back to the bus, the driver stopped at a corner store and bought Ethan a warm cup of hot chocolate. "This ought to cheer you up," he said with a wink. "Nothing beats chocolate on a rainy day." Back on the bus, Ethan sipped the drink carefully, the warmth spreading through his body and easing some of the tension he'd been carrying. He looked up at the driver, who was focused on navigating the wet streets. "Thank you," Ethan said softly, "for helping me." The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me, champ. That's what people do. We take care of each other. Besides, I know your dad would do the same thing if he were here." Ethan nodded, clutching his bear a little tighter. "Daddy always says we should help people whenever we can." "Well, your dad sounds like a smart guy," the driver replied with a smile, "and I'll bet he's doing everything he can to find you right now." Meanwhile, across town, Ethan's father was frantic. He had spent hours searching every street, every shop, and every corner of the area where they'd last been together. His phone buzzed constantly with updates from security teams and local authorities, but none of them had found any trace of his son. Each passing minute felt like an eternity, and the guilt of losing track of Ethan weighed heavily on him. Finally, late in the evening, his phone rang. It was the police. They told him that a bus driver had found Ethan safe and sound and was currently caring for him until they could reunite them. Relief washed over the father like a tidal wave, and tears streamed down his face as he thanked the officer repeatedly. Without wasting another second, he jumped into his car and sped toward the designated meeting point. Back on the bus, Ethan was starting to grow tired. The long day had taken its toll, and his eyelids drooped as he leaned against the seat. The driver noticed and gently suggested that Ethan rest while they waited. "Your dad will be here soon," he assured him. "Close your eyes for a bit. You've had a big day." Ethan hesitated but eventually nodded, curling up with his bear and closing his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing grew steady, and he drifted off to sleep. Watching the boy nap, the driver felt a mix of emotions: pride for having helped, sadness for the fear Ethan had endured, and gratitude for the bond they'd formed in such a short time. When the father finally arrived at the depot, he rushed toward the bus, his heart pounding. Seeing his son asleep on the bus, safe and sound, brought tears to his eyes. He approached the driver, extending a hand in gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I can never repay you for what you've done." The driver shook his hand firmly, smiling despite the gravity of the moment. "Just glad I could help. He's a great kid." As Ethan woke up and saw his father, he leaped into his arms, sobbing with relief. Father and son held each other tightly, unwilling to let go after such a harrowing experience. Watching them reunite filled the driver with a deep sense of satisfaction. Though his role in their story was coming to an end, he knew he'd played a part in something truly meaningful. Later that night, as the driver headed home, he reflected on the events of the day. Helping Ethan hadn't just been about reuniting a lost child with his family. It had reminded him of the power of kindness, patience, and human connection. In a world that often felt chaotic and divided, moments like these proved that even the smallest acts of compassion could make a huge difference. And as he parked the bus for the night, he couldn't help but feel grateful, not just for the chance to help someone in need, but for the reminder that humanity, at its core, was built on love and care. The reunion between Ethan and his father was a moment filled with raw emotion. The boy practically leaped into his dad's arms, wrapping himself around him like a vine clinging to a tree. Tears streamed down both their faces as they held each other tightly, unwilling to let go after such a long and terrifying separation. For the father, it was as if the weight of the entire world had been lifted off his shoulders. His hands trembled as he stroked Ethan's hair, whispering over and over again, "I'm so sorry, buddy. I'll never lose you again." The bus driver, stood nearby watching the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and quiet pride. He could see how much this reunion meant, not just to the father and son, but to everyone who had played even the smallest role in bringing them back together. It reminded him why he loved what he did, even on days when the job felt thankless or exhausting. Moments like these made every early morning shift, every traffic jam, and every difficult passenger worth it. As the initial wave of emotion began to settle, the father turned back to the driver, his gratitude still pouring out. In waves, "I can't tell you how much this means to me," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "You didn't just bring my son back, you brought peace to my heart. I don't know how to repay you." The driver waved off the praise with a modest smile. "No need for that," he replied. "I was just doing what anyone else would have done. You'd have done the same thing if you were in my shoes." But the father wasn't convinced. To him, this wasn't just an act of kindness. It was a lifeline thrown at a time when he felt utterly helpless. He shook the driver's hand firmly, promising to stay in touch before finally leading Ethan away toward their car. As they walked off, Ethan glanced back one last time, waving shyly at the man who had saved his day. The driver returned the wave, with a warm smile, feeling a strange sense of fulfillment wash over him. Later that evening, as the driver sat at home reflecting on the events of the day, he couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary had happened. Sure, he'd helped plenty of people during his years behind the wheel, giving directions to tourists, calming nervous commuters, even helping stranded passengers change flat tires. But this felt different. There was something about Ethan's trusting eyes and the father's heartfelt gratitude that lingered in his mind long after the bus had been parked for the night. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan's father found himself unable to sleep. The adrenaline from the day's ordeal had worn off, leaving behind a deep sense of reflection. Sitting in his study, he replayed every detail of the past few hours: the frantic search, the endless phone calls, the crushing fear of not knowing where his son was. And then finally the call from the police telling him that Ethan had been found safe. He thought about the bus driver, the calm, steady presence who had taken care of his son when he couldn't be there. What struck him most was the man's humility. Despite going above and beyond to ensure Ethan's safety, he hadn't asked for anything in return. In fact, he seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. That kind of selflessness was rare, especially in today's fast-paced, often selfish world. Determined to express his gratitude properly, the father decided to write a letter. He sat down at his desk and began drafting words that came straight from his heart. "Dear Sir, I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to personally thank you for everything you did for my son today. When I lost sight of Ethan, I felt completely lost myself. But thanks to your kindness and quick thinking, he was kept safe until we could be reunited. I will never forget the relief I felt seeing him asleep on your bus, knowing he was in good hands. Your actions reminded me of the goodness that exists in humanity. Please accept this small token of appreciation as a way of saying thank you. You deserve far more than I could ever give, but I hope this gesture shows how deeply grateful I am." With the letter written, the father included a check for $50,000, an amount he knew wouldn't change the driver's life entirely, but would certainly make a difference. He sealed the envelope and sent it off the next morning, hoping it would reach its recipient quickly. When the driver received the letter a few days later, he was stunned. At first, he thought it might be a mistake. Who sends thousands of dollars as a token of appreciation? But as he read the heartfelt words inside, he realized it wasn't a prank or some misunderstanding. It was genuine gratitude wrapped in paper and ink. His hands trembled slightly as he held the check, his mind racing with questions. Should he accept it? Was it okay to keep something like this? After all, he hadn't done anything special. Or so he thought. Helping Ethan had come naturally to him. It wasn't about money or recognition. Still, the father's note made it clear that this gift was meant to honor the impact he'd had, whether he realized it or not. After some thought, the driver decided to use the money wisely, not for himself, but for others. He knew exactly where it should go, back into the community that had shaped him Part of it went toward funding scholarships for underprivileged kids in his neighborhood, giving them opportunities he wished he'd had growing up. Another portion was donated to improve public transportation systems, ensuring that future generations would have access to safe, reliable buses. And yet another chunk went to local food banks and shelters, places he'd volunteered at over the years. Despite this unexpected windfall, the driver continued working his regular shifts. Some people might have quit their jobs after receiving such a generous gift, but not him. He believed staying grounded was important, and besides, he genuinely loved driving the bus. It gave him a chance to meet new people, share stories, and maybe even help someone else in need someday. Word of his generosity spread quickly through the city. Local news outlets picked up the story, painting him as a hero who used his unexpected fortune to uplift those around him. Passengers began recognizing him on his route, offering smiles and words of admiration. Strangers approached him at bus stops, thanking him for being a reminder of the goodness in the world. Yet despite all the attention, the driver remained humble, brushing off compliments with a simple, "I'm just doing what feels right." Ethan's father heard about the driver's decision to give back and felt a renewed sense of respect for the man. Inspired by his example, he reached out once more, not as a billionaire looking to reward someone, but as a fellow human being seeking connection. They met for coffee at a small cafe downtown, bonding over shared values and experiences. Over time, their friendship grew stronger, transcending social and economic boundaries. For Ethan, the driver became a lifelong hero. Whenever he visited his father in Chicago, he made it a point to ride the bus, eagerly scanning the streets until he spotted the familiar face behind the wheel. Each time they saw each other, Ethan greeted him with a wide grin and a wave, reminding the driver of the incredible chain of events that had begun with a rainy afternoon and a lost little boy. Looking back on it all, the driver realized that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could lead to the biggest changes, not just in the lives of others, but in our own as well. And while he may never fully understand why fate brought him and Ethan together that day, he knew one thing for certain. Humanity was capable of incredible things when people chose to look out for one another. The bond between the bus driver and Ethan's father grew stronger with each passing week. What started as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into something neither of them could have predicted. A genuine friendship built on trust, gratitude, and shared values. For the driver, it was humbling to think that his decision to help a lost child had led to such a meaningful connection. And for Ethan's father, it was a reminder of how much good existed in the world, even when life felt overwhelming. Their coffee meetings became a regular thing. They'd meet at the same small cafe downtown, tucked away on a quiet street where the hustle and bustle of the city seemed to fade into the background. The cafe had a cozy charm, wooden tables, mismatched chairs, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. It was the perfect spot for two people from vastly different walks of life to sit down and talk like old friends. During these conversations, they discovered they had more in common than either of them initially realized. Both cared deeply about their communities and believed in giving back whenever possible. The driver spoke passionately about the struggles he saw every day. Families struggling to make ends meet, kids without access to proper education, and neighborhoods neglected by those in power. Ethan's father listened intently, nodding along as he shared stories of his own efforts to support various causes. One afternoon, as they sipped their coffees, the driver leaned forward and said, "You know, I've been thinking. There's so much we can do if we work together. Imagine what might happen if someone with resources like yours teamed up with people who understand the streets, the real needs of the community." Ethan's father smiled thoughtfully. "I've been thinking the same thing," he admitted. "Money alone doesn't fix problems. It takes people who truly care, people like you, to make sure it's used in the right way." That conversation sparked an idea, a partnership aimed at creating lasting change. Together, they began brainstorming ways to address some of the challenges facing the city. One of their first projects focused on improving public transportation. The driver knew firsthand how vital buses were to countless families, yet the system was often underfunded and unreliable. With Ethan's father's financial backing and the driver's insider knowledge, they launched a campaign to modernize aging buses, expand routes, and provide free rides for low-income residents. The initiative quickly gained traction. Local news outlets covered the story, highlighting the unlikely duo behind the effort. People were inspired by the collaboration, a billionaire working hand in hand with a bus driver to improve the lives of everyday citizens. The project not only brought tangible benefits to the community, but also served as a powerful example of what could be achieved when people came together despite their differences. Word spread. Others began stepping forward to contribute. Business owners offered discounts to commuters, schools organized fundraisers to support the cause, and volunteers signed up to help maintain bus stops and keep them clean. The ripple effect was undeniable. What had started as a single act of kindness, the driver helping Ethan, had grown into a movement fueled by compassion and determination. For Ethan, the driver remained a constant presence in his life. Every time he visited his father in Chicago, he insisted on riding the bus, eager to see the man who had once saved him. The driver always greeted him with a warm smile and a playful joke, making Ethan feel like a VIP passenger. Sometimes they'd chat about school or robots or whatever else was on Ethan's mind. Other times they'd simply enjoy the ride, watching the city roll by outside the windows. Ethan's admiration for the driver wasn't just about the day he'd been found. It was about everything the man represented. To Ethan, the driver was proof that heroes didn't wear capes or live in movies. They were real people doing ordinary things with extraordinary kindness. His dad often joked that Ethan wanted to grow up to be just like the driver, though deep down he knew there was no higher compliment. Back at home, the driver reflected on how much his life had changed since that rainy afternoon. Helping Ethan hadn't just reunited a father and son, it had opened doors he never imagined. Through his friendship with Ethan's father, he'd learned the value of collaboration and the importance of using one's platform to uplift others. He'd also discovered a newfound sense of purpose, knowing that his actions, no matter how small they seemed, could create waves of positivity. But perhaps the most profound impact was personal. The driver had always considered himself a simple man, content with his routine and the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Yet meeting Ethan and his father had shown him the beauty of stepping outside his comfort zone. By embracing the unexpected, he'd formed connections that enriched his life in ways he couldn't have anticipated. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, the driver thought about all the twists and turns life had taken. From the moment he spotted Ethan standing alone in the rain to the friendships and opportunities that followed, it was clear that every action carried significance. Even the smallest gesture, a kind word, a helping hand, could set off a chain reaction, touching lives in ways no one could predict. He remembered something Ethan's father had said during one of their coffee chats. "We're all threads in the same tapestry.
Each of us has a role to play, whether we realize it or not." At the time, the driver had nodded politely, not fully grasping the depth of the statement. But now, as he looked back on everything that had happened, it made perfect sense. Every
person, no matter their background or circumstances, contributed to the bigger picture. And sometimes, when fate wove those threads together just right, magic happened. The driver chuckled softly to himself, shaking his head at the irony. Here, he was, a man who spent his days driving a bus, reflecting on life like a philosopher. But then again, maybe that was the point. Life wasn't about titles or wealth or status, it was about moments. Moments of connection, courage, and compassion. Moments that reminded us of our shared humanity. As the sky turned shades of orange and pink, the driver felt a deep sense of peace. He didn't need recognition or applause to know he'd made a difference. The smiles on passengers' faces, the laughter of children like Ethan, the gratitude of strangers, those were the rewards that mattered most. And as long as he kept showing up, doing what he could to make the world a little brighter, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Little did he know, his story was far from over. The seeds of kindness he'd planted continued to grow, inspiring others to follow in his footsteps. Across the city, acts of generosity began popping up like wildflowers after a spring rain. Neighbors helped neighbors. Strangers lent a hand. Communities came together, united by the belief that even in a busy, chaotic world there was room for goodness. And somewhere in the heart of it all, a bus driver sat quietly, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He didn't consider himself a hero, but to everyone whose life he'd touched, he was exactly that. A beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest storms, light could shine through.